Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Here we are, looking luminous.
Yeah, radiate wisdom and light.
You look more luminous than I do with your professional studio lighting.
I have nice lighting.
Yeah.
It is the 1st of September.
Woohoo!
Can we agree? Like, I know this is a sore subject for you, and it's contentious, but now that it's September, are you a little bit more open to pumpkin spice in lattes? Does it seem more legitimate now?
No.
It's like 60 something degrees outside and gray.
Yeah, pumpkin spice belongs in the pumpkin okay corral there. Just like with all the other pumpkin things. Then I'm fine with it. But it's when it's on bacon and hand wash and facial scrub and
I mean, I don't want a facial scrub. I don't understand what a little bit of cloves and cinnamon is going to do for my face, except for make me smell like pumpkins.
There you go.
Well, anyways, before this gets heated, we need to shift gears, introduce ourselves, and talk about something lighter, which is leftist politics. I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. I've got my MICA t-shirt on again today. Ta-da. There it is.
There it is.
In all its glory. And good morning, everybody. We're getting a lot of good mornings. I appreciate that.
Just to throw this on so we can get it out of the way, like, you're a heretic, and so is Kathleen.
Yes.
She's also never a pumpkin spicer. I mean, when the Great War comes, I don't know if I'll be able to protect you.
That's all right. I'll be a pretend pumpkin spicer at that point.
Okay, that's smart.
Yeah.
So this is a series, a 3-part.
Right, we're doing a series.
Yeah, we're putting on our big boy pants, I guess. This seems like it's like an expose, investigative journalism. But we realized, like, in a recent episode, we talked a lot about the left, and the way that people were referring to the left shows like how drifty that word is in American political discourse in particular, because it means all sorts of different things. And so I thought we should just talk about this.
Yeah.
And then talk about a couple of the issues that that pop up in leftist conversation. Tomorrow we'll talk about spirituality, and then after that we're going to talk about nonviolence. Yeah. And they really get at the heart of a lot of times people are just talking about two different things when they're talking about
or seven different
or seven, and so they know how to talk with each other.
Yeah, and then we get Joe Biden being accused of being a leftist, which just proves how disordered the entire conversation has become.
Yeah, you see it sliding all over the place. So Biden, accused of being a socialist by the Republicans. And then also, like, there's this thing that happens with those of us who kind of are left-leaning or on the left. Before he gets the nomination, people are more than ready just to call him a centrist. But then after the nomination, there's this psychological thing that happens where progressives need to feel like they're voting for a progressive. So then all of a sudden people start saying, well, actually, he might be the most progressive president we've ever had.
All right, so let's talk about in the beginning. I mean, where did these terms come from, right? That's a fun thing to think about. And
I mean, most people point to the French Revolution as kind of where we get the spectrum from, right?
Right. Well, so it's very interesting, I think, and as a left-handed person, I think I've got particular interest in this because I think that it really comes out of a prejudice against left-handed people, like deep in the human psyche, right? So
you're far left because you're I'm left, but you are left-handed, so you can reach even farther left than me.
That's right. So, in feudalism, monarchic times, right, there is this notion that there is somebody that sits on this is my right hand, even though it's showing up left in the video, that there is somebody that sits on the right hand of the king, right? We even have that in religion, right? So, Jesus sits at the right hand of God. And this, again, I think that this is because most people are right-handed. So we have this idea of the right hand being this dominant, more important side. And so that person was the most trusted advisor and ally of the king, right? And sometimes it was, his regent or, his son, if he trusted his son and hadn't already killed him, or, and so the right became this symbol for loyalty to the monarch. And then, right around the time of the French Revolution, there was a sort of primitive parliament in France. It wasn't a true parliament because there was still a king, but kind of this primitive parliament. And so the people who were loyal to the ruler sat on the right, and the people who were in favor of a more revolutionary position sat on the left side of parliament. And they actually divided up that way. And if somebody who was on the right would try to sit on the other side, and there's some funny letters and documents about this, they would just get trashed, and the people would beat on them and tease them and all this stuff. And so they would have to go back and sit on the other side, and vice versa, right? And so this was the first time that these two words, this right and left, got used in terms of politics. And so if you were on the left, you were more in favor of revolution. And if you were on the right, again, you were more supportive of the king, and thus more, quote, conservative. You were trying to conserve the old political order.
Yeah.
So this is where it got started. And then, of course, began to evolve as different forms of both leftist and rightist thinking started to arise.
Mm-hmm. And so then, traditionally, within the European context, and this, of course, gets all very interesting when you start looking at it through the lens of colonization and different political approaches that existed outside of Europe. And now that we're all bumping into each other, you get communism, which is a philosophy from a German, finds its way into Maoism, a Chinese form of socialism that's trying to get towards some sort of Marxist ideal, right? So it gets all kind of soupy, very different. But traditionally, when people would talk about the left as this growing tradition, they talk about socialists, anarchists, and then maybe you'd include the social democrats sometimes. But really, it was largely framed in economics and who has power kinds of sense. So like redistributing wealth and power going to the people. That's right. Kind of really left. Now it gets more complicated because then there's all these issues that pop up within that, right? Slavery. So you had leftists for slavery. You had people that maybe even were right-wing against slavery. And so that was an issue that was economic, but not just economic. And so now you could be on a spectrum with this thing, economics, but then also have a different spectrum of how human you're willing to grant someone is a black person is, right?
Right. Yeah, and what this shows, of course, is that how a term that has a very clear, particular meaning at one moment in history, as history goes along, it all gets very fuzzy, right? So if originally this term is just, are you for having a king or are you against having a king? Right? That's becomes this pretty clear, like one issue sort of term. Now, well, what happens when you don't have kings, right? Well, now you replace kings with different forms of elected officials, different ways of organizing society, different economic modes, right? And so now what does left and right mean? I mean, does it have to do with, what you think, how you think the economy should be organized? Does it have to do with multiple issues, or is it really just one issue? right? So, and Mark, as you mentioned, the whole issue of colonialism, right? You had many, many people across the entire political spectrum in Europe that were all basically in favor of colonialism, right? So that was not an issue where the left and right necessarily would split, but they might split on all kinds of other things. And so that's how that mishmash starts to evolve.
Well, it gets into all kinds of this, we can get into the weeds with this, but, at a certain point, we're going to probably pivot and talk about the uniqueness of the American experience. But you, like in Europe right now, when you talk about rising right-wing governments, sometimes they're talking about economics, but when you start talking about alt-right and neo-fascism, it's like a way of talking about race. And so you can really get, and you see some of this here, but it's a lot stronger in Europe, people who are very much socialists, but for their group, right?
Right.
And so what we mean is only Swedes, and by Swedes we mean people whose families came from here for far enough back,
Right.
really should get in on this. But yeah, we're socialists. And so
and when we were talking before we started, I gave an example of this. I was hearing this Norwegian guy being interviewed on the radio the other day, and at one point he got talking about the rise of the right wing in Scandinavia. And then at one point he said, but you have to realize that even the right wing parties in Scandinavia would be considered leftists here in America because everyone is a socialist. Mm-hmm. Right. And so, for Americans, that's just like, well, what, your brain kind of goes on tilt. Like, well, what does that even mean?
And so looking at the United States through this lens, we use several different terms. Liberal and conservative. We have a liberal and a conservative party. And so our tendency is to think of the liberals are left and conservatives are right. But from this broader perspective, the liberals maybe are centrist because they're pro-capitalism.
Right.
Right. And other things that like also fairly pro-military and creating a line of like our liberal ideals only extend so far. And then the right, of course, can go even further right. And so in our political discourse, when we say the left, we could mean Democrats. You could mean the actual socialists and anarchists and whatever that are here. And then you throw this other word in there, progressive, right, which sometimes people mean to say I'm almost left, or they mean I'm really super liberal, or it could just mean I'm socially liberal, like I'm pro LGBTQ.
Right, and so if we look, so if we look at the history of this, kind of recentering on some of that history. So, as it evolves into the 19th and 20th century, left and right generally come to be about economic systems, right? And what are the role of people and the workers in the economic system? Right, and so people who are more on the right are generally identify as capitalists, and so certain people own the means of production, and the workers are just working for wages and aren't owners, right? And so those on the left tend to identify with some sort of worker ownership and power. Right, and that comes to be called, socialism, communism, Marxism, all these different things. But the idea is that the workers are going to be liberated from capitalists. And now, in America, when all this sort of comes to America, basically, in a lot of ways, that whole leftist view gets very little traction. Very, very little traction at all.
It had moments
There's moments,
with violent reactions.
Yes.
So, and this ties in with the police stuff. Like, so at the turn of the century, you had the international workers of the world, and the sketchy Italians. Like, people were afraid of these Italian immigrants coming over, and the Irish, and they were leftists. And many of them were anarchists. And so you had the Pinkertons, were brought in to just crush labor revolts and stuff. So there was some movement there that got crushed. And then, of course, the specter of Soviet communism and the Red Scare made it entirely uncool to call yourself a socialist.
Yeah. So let's throw up some questions and comments here.
Okay. Let's go back to CK. I'm gonna do this in my best voice, in the voice of you. Extremists there are, centrist only. There is no left. Is that pretty good?
Yeah, it was good, except there was an internet glitch right while you were doing it, so Yoda got sent into the void.
It's better that way.
Okay.
Yeah, just a quick comment. That's funny, the word extremist here. We also assume extremist means super, super intense and only can apply to if you're far right, if you're far left, and that's impossible to be an extremist centrist. That's people, we instinctively think that way, and that's BS. If you're willing to kill people to maintain the status quo, which we do all the time, you're an extremist in my estimation. When did the word liberal become an insult?
Right.
I have no idea.
Yeah. Well, it really actually started in many ways in the United States with FDR. And again, this is, to me, the interesting thing about the evolution of terms, right? So liberalism originally refers to the process of the Enlightenment, when there was this whole idea of education that was free from control by the church. And that's what was liberal. And so, in many ways, right, pretty much everybody in the Western world is liberal. I mean, if you've gone to public school, that is a liberal idea. But then in the 30s, and probably this has something to do with the fact that leftist was seen as a super, super bad thing. And so liberal got attached to the quote left wing in America. And so ever since, it's kind of been downhill since then.
Now this gets murky because not to be confused with classical liberalism, when somebody uses that term, like Jordan Peterson.
Who?
Yeah, exactly. That's usually a way of referring to, that's an Enlightenment position that we in the United States would almost entirely link with what we call libertarianism, which this is such a murky conversation. So here, Mark writes, please also speak to the additional distinctions between authoritarian and libertarian, which exists on both sides of the political spectrum. Yeah, globally speaking, libertarian is that tendency towards anti-authoritarian. And for most of the rest of the world, libertarian is actually a type of socialism. It's anti-authoritarian socialism, or social or anarchism, basically. But in the United States, libertarian means super far right wing, generally speaking. But you can be a libertarian socialist, but here libertarian is a type of conservative where has a strong emphasis on individual rights over and against any communal responsibilities.
Yeah. And so, I think in that you see very, very clearly how the underlying assumptions about society and people's connection in society really creep in, right? So if you have a society that has a very strong collective impulse, freedom does not mean you don't have a collective. And so you can have libertarian socialism, right, where there's a lot of freedom, where the people and the collective determine things. You don't have an authoritarian figure that are running the collective, but you still have the collective. Now in America, where we have this rabid individualism, right? Liberty means liberty for the individual to do whatever the hell they want. And so socialism in America is felt and perceived to be very anti-liberty. because it means people have to work together and do things together. And so you've got to layer the social psychological formation in with these political concepts to see how they manifest in a particular cultural context.
It is fascinating. I could nerd out on this all day, but when we start pulling at these ideas that we take for granted, so one of them is, if you're liberal in the broadest sense of the word at all, you will say that you're centering it on the idea of human rights, right? And so conservatives and liberals, or left and right, would both say they're about human rights, but then they have different ways of understanding what that means. And what is property the primary human right? Or is, the other thing? But we take it for granted. Like, one of my favorite thinkers, Simone Weil, didn't like the idea of rights. She talked about replacing it with a set of social obligations. So instead of, if you have a rights-based system where someone has the right to life, liberty, and property, if you're homeless, no one's defeating your rights because it's up to you. If you talk about social obligations, then the society is failing that person. And so liberty is everyone having us being accountable and responsible for each other. And that kind of thinking makes sense for a Jewish woman in France in the 40s, but it wouldn't really fly here very well at all.
No, not at all.
Joseph writes,
we're up to Heather.
Heather first. Social Security left behind by the right.
Right. Yeah, and so Social Security, was by many considered to be this very socialist, un-American idea. Right, the idea that we're all paying in, to help each other out. And in many ways, Social Security is probably the most clearly traditionally leftist program that America has ever put forward. And it's no coincidence that that's being attacked by the hyper capitalist folks, because it is a pro-worker program, right? That you work, you pay in, you get some money back.
Joseph writes, it seems like in the U.S., centralized power is the feared entity by the right. Yeah, so it's a good point. When the right wing, when conservatives say the word socialist, they mean authoritarian, centralized government. Which is not how most socialists define the word socialism. And it isn't hard to imagine a leftist agenda without centralization, aka big government.
Yeah, and the thing is, though, that we've got to be careful. Politicians try to make us believe in these grandiose statements, right? But if you think back to the original definition of left and right, those who were on the right were in favor of the king. And what was the king's biggest single program, right? It was the military. And so in the right usually is very much in favor of a very centralized power military. And, we see that in the United States. And it's one of the reasons that, to me, very clearly, we do not have a major left party in this country, because both the Democrats and the Republicans are steadfastly in favor of a massive military industrial complex. That is never up for question at all. And so the right tends to be very much in favor of centralized military power, and yet they want decentralized economic power, but they want the military to support their economic power. Right, which is essentially what imperialism is. So they want the military to be able to allow them to go all over the world and conquer people and scoop up their resources for low prices.
And this gets into like domestic military or policing. The other thing that right-wingers like is since the core sacred trust of a right-wing person in the United States of America is one's relationship to their property. Now, this isn't just me being cynical. It's true. Like,
No.
it's ownership is like, that's the way you extend yourself into the world, is through ownership and your relationship to ownership. And then if you lack ownership of something, you enter into mutual agreement with someone to exchange what you do have for access to some of that wealth. And if you play your cards right, you succeed too. That's the idea. It's BS. And so the government exists to protect also, like, your property. That's what the police exists for.
Well, and what's one of the major and governments deal with? It's automobile licensing and registration. I mean, that's one of the major programs that our society is involved with. You know, that and real estate. And we pour billions and billions of dollars into organizing and protecting that stuff for exactly the reasons you're talking about.
Did we get to CK's comment yet?
Nope.
It seems to me that the campaign of disinformation and misinformation has completely clouded meaning and purpose
Yes.
for the layman. But yeah, just in general, not even just for the layman.
Yeah, absolutely. The point is confusion, not clarification.
That we're so fractured and confused seems largely by design, because then it's easier for singular dominant narratives to assert themselves. And they're so successful being dominant that both parties adhere to some of the big myths of our society without us ever questioning it. Which leads to Sirius's comment. So basically, what's considered healthy community in American society is vastly different than other cultures who have collective consciousness. Well, that's why one of the reasons why this melting pot image got pushed so heavily is so when communities come with a different sense of social cohesion and obligations, it's in the best interest of the powers that be to fracture that, to increase what's called superfluidity, where you don't have roots anywhere.
Yeah.
So that
and you know, Sirius, one way that I saw that really clearly, I was the first white person to have worked at this particular Korean Presbyterian church, and you could see how the elders and the parents in that community were very collectivist. Many of them, you know, first generation immigrants. Basically, all of the adults were first generation immigrants, very highly collectivist. And you could see already how individualistic the teenagers were. And there was an incredible fracture line within that community. And it was very, very difficult and painful. And yeah, you could see how the Americanization of this second generation was really leading to a breakdown in community.
we have a lot more comments left than I thought coming to the end, so I'm going to try to blaze through these, but
blaze.
they might be chewier than we can blaze easily. I think the problem with how America views and subsequently demonizes socialism is that it lumps all forms of socialism together. Anarcho-syndicalists ain't Stalinists.
Right. And this is where, you know, we've sort of said this in a couple of different ways, but to be very, very clear, I mean, there is no left that has significant power in America. And that's part of what you're talking about, Carson, is that everything is just lumped into this bad blob. And I really think that McCarthyism has been far more effective than we've given it credit for. Mm-hmm. So we lump everything into the bad blob and then just say, we got to chuck it.
Well, and this is important just to underscore when in relationship to our conversation the other day about fascism. One of the reasons why fascism was able to grow in Italy and Germany is because the people were more afraid of socialism than fascism. And so there was an intentional pitting, a polarization that Hitler fed in order to gain power. And so we got to watch that here. Like when everything
Yeah, well, we're seeing that now here. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a reason Trump talks about socialist and Antifa all the freaking time, even though socialists have little power in this country and Antifa doesn't really even exist the way people talk about it.
Right.
And speaking of left-wing parties, what are y'all's thoughts on the Up and Rising People's Party? They just had their first convention this weekend, I believe. I don't know anything about them.
Yeah. Well, and we don't have time to talk in detail about this, but after yesterday, Mark and I were talking about this some, and the fact that we have a winner-take-all electoral system and we don't have a parliamentary system basically means that we cannot have the rise of a plethora of diverse political parties who actually can end up having some power and some significance in the government. And now all we've got are these two monolithic blobs, and anybody that wants to join another party just gets, dumped on as, ruining the election for one of the two big parties. But when you have a parliamentary system, I mean, there are countries throughout the world where you maybe have 30 parties, and maybe they only have one or two parliamentary seats, but maybe they're very powerful in terms of forming a coalition government and can advance some of their particular interests. And we just can't get any traction on that with a winner-take-all two-party system.
And it's why it's fascinating that we have the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, which is one of the more significant third parties, that their platform and position is not to be a third party, but to work within the Democratic Party system. So that's why you have a symbol like AOC would be, if we had a parliamentary system, would probably be Green Party or Democratic Socialists.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I mean, Bernie Sanders, all that crew. Yeah, they'd be part of their own party.
Yeah. So what we're really talking, this is Adam. So really what we're talking about is capitalism becoming so ubiquitous that it's become political, religious, and personal belief systems. The corporatization of all things is really what spurred this individualization. Quote, I can buy my way out of anything, and if you can't, it's because you're failing. Yep.
Right.
That's very well put. Most of the things done by the New Deal, which is FDR's political platform and things that he pushed, happened because they were actual leftists. Yes, right. Some IWW folks you mentioned were there to push. FDR and his friends did things like Social Security and also raising the marginal tax rate to into the 80s, which is huge. They did that because these rich people were more afraid in that moment of uprisings and revolt than they were of paying higher taxes. So this is why when people say, no, we need to be conciliatory, we need to keep people where they're at and win them over. Well, we got to be honest that a lot of our major political movements have happened because the right wing was afraid. And so fear can be helpful. That's how we got rid of slavery. So let's not be too quick to vilify people who seem a little bit more militant than we like. 1917 wasn't that long ago for them, and it wasn't out of the realm of the possible.
No.
Ray writes, it seems on at least some level a political spectrum from far right to far left is tolerated, if not accepted, in many democratic societies. What is going on in the U.S. is that makes this spectrum completely intolerable, a product of our winner-takes-all representation, a nasty byproduct of toxic capitalism.
Yeah, well, that's why I say that I think McCarthyism and the Cold War has been far more effective than we give it credit for, because that very much was about stomping out that spectrum. No. All right, keep on rolling.
Rights are bought and paid for, like the realization that if you can afford the ticket, it's not actually illegal to park in that illegal space. You're just paying for the space, right? Or the right to park there. You don't have the money, it's illegal. You can't pay the ticket, now you're a criminal. That's a very helpful way of looking at this. And it really starts, if you start looking at laws through the lens of who can afford to deviate from those laws, it changes your perspective entirely. Pumpkin Blaze.
Pumpkin Blaze. All right.
Is that my new name?
CK's throwing down for some pumpkin.
really appreciating the context you're offering here, specifically around libertarianism and what that means in the context here. Also loved hearing about rights versus obligations. Thanks for the talk.
You're welcome.
And really, how easy has it been for corporations to infiltrate and usurp two parties? Diversity is a practical defense against so many things.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and again, because the two parties here are basically pro-hyper capitalist parties, they're completely open to being bought. And, and that's why the Citizens United case is something that, America accepts and the two parties accept. And right, if you had a diverse group of leftist parties that have all other set of voices being lifted up, just get squashed here.
Serious rights, even being able to live without money and job is bought for too. Sorry, I missed the beginning. Who are the speakers? I like what they're saying. Well, hi, Tim.
All right.
We usually introduce ourselves at the beginning, but I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I'm the director for the Center for Prophetic Imagination.
And I'm Daniel Wolpert. I direct MICA, the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing. And this wraps up part one of our first 3-part series.
And
so join us tomorrow.
And this was barely scratching the surface, so we'll probably circle around to some of this again later. Thanks for all the comments and questions. Yeah. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about spirituality in the left. So that'll be interesting. Looking forward to it.
All right.
See you all tomorrow.
See ya.